Hello, I'm William Robinson, Senior Curator of Modern Art at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I'm here to talk about this wonderful exhibition, Dancing in the Light. It's about the age of Impressionism in American art. Impressionism emerged in France in the late 1860s. By the 1870s, many artists had joined. It became an international movement, and American artists were key to the development of Impressionism. The Impressionists followed the dictum of the French poet Charles Baudelaire to become painters of modern life. So the Impressionists were very interested in abandoning mythological themes, historical themes, looking at the world around them, recording contemporary life. But even more important than what they painted was how they painted. They wanted to paint in a new style, a radically new method, in which instead of studying something carefully over a long period of time, drawing carefully, modeling it, they wanted quick results. They worked quickly, often outdoors. They ignored traditional drawing. They worked quickly using pure paint squeezed directly from paint tubes, and they wanted to capture the spirit of the modern world. Now, their critics, they thought these artists weren't creating finished paintings. They weren't finished in a traditional way. What the Impressionists were after was vibrancy, life, and an attempt to capture the spirit of the modern age. Now, this event was associated with very important changes in the culture and history of the United States. Up until the Civil War, American artists were very concerned with defining a uniquely American art. They painted the Hudson River Valley and subjects like that. After the Civil War, there was a revival of spirit, a new optimism, and growing wealth in the United States. And American artists began to take advantage of new advances in transportation, new railroads, the steamship. You know, before the Civil War, on a sailing ship, it took over a month to cross the Atlantic. On a steamship, you could do it in 6 to 10 days. So what you had was increasing wealth, American artists traveling abroad, engaging with modern artists in Europe and with modern ideas. So this was a really exciting development in the history of the United States. New art schools grew up. You had the age of museums being established and art colonies all across the East Coast and here in Ohio as well. There was a new generation of American artists who emerged after the Civil War who changed the trajectory of American art. You see some of them here: Winslow Homer, James McNeill Whistler, John Singer Sargent. Now, these people were really international artists. Sargent was born in Florence to a wealthy family. He lived in London and Paris. He worked with a group of American artists in Venice. So this was really a cosmopolitan age in which they were all exploring this new subject and style of painting called Impressionism. And then they began bringing it back to the United States. So what you had were waves of American artists from all across the country going to Europe, interacting with European artists, showing in European exhibitions. You have some major American artists like Sargent, who went to Giverny, met Claude Monet, the great French Impressionist, worked together with Monet. There were other American artists who formed a colony of artists right next to Monet. They worked together, and in fact, one of them married Monet's stepdaughter. So this was an age of great interaction between Europeans and Americans and a flowering of the arts in the United States. You will see in this exhibition an incredible range and diversity of artists. Some American artists would merge different trends international. They were very interested in realism, but they would merge that with aspects of Impressionism to create a style that I called International Impressionism. This was such an exciting moment in American art, and it was also a moment at which women came to the fore and made important contributions to the development of Impressionism. There are at least 5 women in this show who you will see were part of this movement. Prior to the Civil War, women were barred from art schools. They were not allowed to train as other artists. Those barriers fell down after the Civil War. Women began going to art schools, forming clubs and associations. They began showing at museums. They began traveling in great numbers. And there are several from Ohio that are part of this movement. And you'll see them in this show. Some of them devoted their entire lives to their professional work. They traveled all throughout the world, painting sites in an impressionist manner, which seemed appropriate. So that's a very exciting aspect of this exhibition. And one other thing that I'd like you to pay attention to, and that is that the influence of Impressionism lasted for decades. So in the early part of the 20th century, you have several new art movements, avant-garde movements, American scene realism, and those artists were all influenced by Impressionism. So you will see artists like Maurice Prendergast or George Lux, who were associated with avant-garde or American scene Ashcan realism, taking Impressionism and making something new of it, so that you have this dominant influence of Impressionism in American art lasting until the 1930s. And that's what this wonderful show is about. I think people will really be surprised, and I hope delighted, by the great variety and range of works in the show, from the 1870s into the 1920s, through artists of all different stripes, and in which you see artists exploring this new expression of the modern spirit.